Okay, in this section, we're going to talk about the flexible budget. A flexible budget is a budget prepared for a different level of volume than the one originally anticipated. As an example, we might decide we're going to sell 5,000 units. And so we budget based upon the 5,000 units. And then we have a number that we are going to be sticking to on our budget. But if we end up selling 6,000 units, is it really fair to compare our numbers to what all the numbers we generated based upon 5,000 units? And so the obvious answer may be no, it's not fair. We have to go back and adjust the budget based upon the new volume. So what we're going to be striving to do is comparing apples to apples, volumes to the correct volumes. And for performance evaluation purposes at the end of the period, we're going to look to try to judge whether we're meeting our performance measures based upon volumes. Did the volumes go higher than expected? And if so, let's adjust our budget accordingly. Actual sales volume times the budgeted assumptions. So I want you to think about it in this way. From a flexible budget, we're relying less on the total numbers, but we're going to budget based upon volumes. So therefore, our budget is really per unit, except for fixed costs. Fixed costs are budgeted at that cost for whatever it is, but our variable costs are going to be based upon per unit. So our budget is per unit rather than total. So the master budget variance is the difference between the actual revenues and expenses in the master planning budget. Again, if we're looking at a master budget, sometimes that's referred to as a static budget, means we're just comparing numbers that we came up with at the beginning of the year and comparing it to what we actually came up with. But if the volumes were significantly different, then one could argue that that's not really comparing apples to apples. It's really comparing apples to oranges. The master budget planning purpose is at the beginning of the period. So here's an example of a master budget performance report where you're looking at the sales volume, the actual, the budget, and the master budget variances. The actual sales revenue was $653,874. The budget was $600,000. Well, if we compare the two, we'd say, well, we ended up coming up actually better than our budget. So we were higher. Well, we may think that, okay, well, that's good, right? Well, yeah, it's always good, but the question becomes, is that related to the volume or is it related to the price? Well, we'll look at, if we're just going to budget, we're going to come up with a variance of $53,874. That's the difference between the master budget and the actual, $53,874. So we conclude that it's a favorable. If we go to the next item, let's just pick one of these variable costs, the shipping expense. It's $2 per case. $2 per case times 30,000 gives us $60,000. So that was our master budget. Now the amount that we sold was 62,180. So our expenses were higher than expected. And so that's going to give us an unfavorable variance of 2,180. Now go to a manager and try to tell them this. Tell them, hey, you ended up spending more than $2,180 more than what you were budgeted. You missed your goal. And the manager's going to say, well, of course I spent more because our volumes were higher. This master budget doesn't allow for the changes in volume. It's just saying, here's the static budget. Those are the numbers we're going to compare your performance to, and there's no choice. You just got to look at that. And you can see that that may not be fair, because if the volumes change, then you may have to look at maybe adjusting your budget. That would be the flexible budget. Right now, we're just looking at the master budget, or what I often refer to as a static budget. It doesn't change, okay? And then your fixed costs, let's look at office rent, $4,000. We knew what that was going to be. It was, they're fixed in nature, so there really shouldn't be any real good reason why we miss on that. So, you might miss because of maybe salaries, maybe you had to hire an extra person, I don't know. But for the most part, fixed costs are fixed. Okay, so that's the master budget. Remember, the master budget is static. It does not change. No matter what the volumes are, whatever the actual volumes, they do not change. You just look at the master budget and compare it to the actual and make a determination. But you can see how this could lead to false assumptions as to the performance. Now we'll look at a flexible budget. The sales volume sold was, we're going to adjust the budget to what the actual was. In other words, we actually sold 32,370. Well, let's adjust our flexible budget to that. Remember, the master budget was only based on 30,000. But what we're going to do then is, based upon this change in volumes, we're going to adjust our sales, we're going to adjust our cost of goods sold, we're going to adjust our sales commission, all the variable costs based upon the per unit amounts. And that's why I mentioned earlier, when we're using a flexible budget, really we're just budgeting the per unit. And then once we have our actual, we'll come up with our actual budget. And they call it flexible because it adjusts based upon the volumes, okay? So we're going to adjust all. So as an example here, since we sold 32,370, then our sales commission, oh no, I think we did the shipping expense, right? I don't know. Let's go with the shipping expense. So 32,370 volume, the 32,370 quantity multiplied by the $2 per unit gives us the 64,740. So that becomes our budget. We adjusted it. In the static budget, it was simply 60,000. It didn't change based on volumes. In the flexible budget, it does change based upon per unit. The per unit is used for our variable expenses, okay? So now we have an adjusted budget. Now the fixed costs don't change because they're not a function of the volumes. If they're fixed, they're fixed. So they're going to remain the same. But our variable costs will adjust based upon the volumes. Now we're going to look at our actual numbers and we'll compare it to the flexible. So sales, for example, we have a favorable variance, but when we looked at the static budget, let's go back to the static budget. We had a favorable variance of $53,874. That's a pretty big variance, right? But when we adjusted the budget based upon volumes, we still ended up with a favorable variance, but it's only $6,474. So this is something to be really, really happy about, because not only did the sales and marketing people sell more than was anticipated, but it appears, because it's a favorable variance, that they sold it for a better price, okay? So that's good news. If we look at shipping expenses, we ended up with a favorable variance of $2,560. $2,560 because we adjusted our flexible budget to $64,740. Now, let's go back to the static budget or to the master budget, and you can see that according to the master budget, we had an unfavorable variance. You see that? Unfavorable variance. And so you're going to yell at your managers because they have an unfavorable variance. The manager's going to say, "What are you yelling at me for? You know, our volumes were much higher than what we anticipated, so you can't yell at me for that." So you think about it, you say, you know, that kind of makes sense. Let's come up with a flexible budget and see how that looks. And when you look at this flexible budget, you could see that, in fact, the budget went up based upon volumes, and so they came up lower than what the budget was. So they had a favorable variance, okay? No changes for the fixed expenses analysis. That's going to be the same no matter what. Favorable and unfavorable don't change. So we're really talking, when we're talking about a flexible budget, we're talking about changes to the variable costs. We're modifying the budget based upon volumes. Once we've identified we have variances, we need to start looking for reasons why we have variances. Now, the accountants can give you the variances, they can compute the variances, and sometimes they can give you some guidance based upon experience, but in most cases, the real decision as to why something is either favorable or unfavorable is really going to have to come from the supervisors, from the management, because they're the ones working the lines. They can explain why certain things have occurred. So in this case, when we're looking about the sales revenue variances, two favorable variances, the flexible budget came up with a $6,474 favorable variance, and that was purely based upon price. Well, we can simply take the difference between the flexible budget and the master budget. If we take that difference, if we take the 53,874 and we subtract the 64,74, those were both favorable variances, but we're going to subtract the price variance, and that's going to give us the volume. So the reason why we had such a 53,874 favorable variance for the master budget was partly due, well, almost completely due by the volumes, because the volumes went up 47,400. But even after the volumes were up, we still had a nice price variance as well. Now, when we look at the sales commissions variance, looks like the flexible budget was 1305 unfavorable. The master budget was 4860 unfavorable. So the difference really can be explained away by the volumes. So we're not real pleased about a 1305 unfavorable, but we certainly shouldn't get on our managers about a 4860 unfavorable, because of that 4860, 3555 was really associated with the volumes. And then the shipping expense variance, 2180 overall unfavorable, but we're not going to yell at our managers there at all, because in fact, when we looked at the flexible budget, they're at 2560 favorable. Now, in this case, you're not going to take the difference between the two, because this was unfavorable and this was favorable. So it crossed over the zero. So you're really going to add the two to come up with your volume variance. Or you can go look back at the, well, you can look at the master budget, unfavorable, and the crossover to the fixed, master to the volume, the flexible budget, and you have 2560 there. That difference is going to make up the 4740 unfavorable volume variance. Moving on to investigating causes for the variance, managed by exception. I already explained to you how that works. We need the performance reports to understand how operational decisions are affecting the company's finances. And then the manufacturing cost variances receive a great deal of attention. The higher the variance, the more attention. And then it's not necessarily dollar amount, but percentages. Which ones are the ones that are significantly different than what we expected? And that's what we're going to focus in on. We can't ignore non-financial performance measurements. Okay, there are some lag indicators that we need to pay attention to. And these lag indicators tend to reveal results of the past decisions and actions. In other words, when we come up a volume variance, or we come up with a flexible variance, or we come up with a master budget variance, that's kind of after the fact. It tells you what occurred based upon decisions that were made in the past. So what we're going to be looking for are what are referred to as lead indicators. Those things that we can look at and measure before they occur that can give us some indication that something is on the horizon. And in strategic planning, you often see top management introduce what is referred to as a balance scorecard. And the balance scorecard recognizes that management must consider both financial performance measures and operational performance measures. So we're going to incorporate some things that are less quantifiable in terms of dollars especially, and use that as a basis of determining why we're ending up where we end up. And so we're going to spend a lot of time looking for those kind of elements. Which one of these elements that we have within our organization, or what systems do we have in place, or what decisions are we making, or what things that are going on a day-to-day basis can we use as a basis to judge whether we're heading in the right direction? It's almost like trying to find these things before we end up with the variances that come up on the back end. An acronym that's often used for this is finding what are referred to as key performance indicators, or KPIs. And what we're talking about is a summary of performance metrics used to assess how well a company is achieving its goals. And then these KPIs are then put together and reported on what's referred to as a performance scorecard. Okay, so the balance scorecard really takes into consideration 4 areas. First of all, the financial performance, or the financial perspective. How do we look relative to the shareholders, or how do we look to the shareholders? That's what we're going to look at when we're talking about the financial perspective. And that's arguably one of the most important elements, especially when we're talking about keeping jobs and CEOs still being in place. It's the financial perspective. But even before then, we're going to look at some things that lead us to the financial numbers that we want. And so one thing that often does is if we look at the customer's perspective, all right, what is it from the customer are we focusing in on to help make sure that the numbers actually make some sense, all right? Well, before we get to the customers, how about we look at our internal business? What are some things about our processes that help give value to the customer? And then before we look at internal businesses, let's look at learning and growth. What are we doing to improve our value within the organization and helping our employees in terms of learning and growth? So if we have all these, these elements in place, these where we can establish key performance indicators, if these if we're doing well in these areas, then there's a very good chance that our financial perspective is going to come out very good. So we're going to set our company goals. We're going to set our company goals as to where we want to be in the future. And then from there, we're going to look for critical factors. What are some things that are going to help us achieve those goals? Some of them are financial and some of them are not. But when we're going through that process, we're going to identify those that are financial and even non-financial. And then from there, we're going to come up with what we refer to as key performance indicators. Okay? So as an example, some of the key performance, let's start with here. A key performance indicator, a KPI, could be market share. Well, how do we judge whether we're going to get a percentage of market share that we really want? Well, how about customer satisfaction? We could look at that as being a basis by which to develop a greater market share. So let's make sure we're focusing on customer satisfaction. How about a yield rate? That's a number that you could actually hang your hat on. That's quantifiable, but can we find a way of measuring our operational efficiencies? If we're better at operational efficiencies, that may yield or may end up with a higher yield rate than we had before. Employee training hours helps us with employee excellence, and employee excellence can help lead us to employee training hours. Revenue and growth, well, that's going to lead to financial profitability. Okay, so these go back and forth, they help one another, and we're looking at these as being key performance indicators. If we're doing well with the market share, if our yield rates are good, if our employee training hours are good, and with our revenue growth is good, then maybe we can help achieve the critical factors that we need to do what? To achieve our specific company goals. Okay, so there were 4 areas of the quadrant. The first one was on the left top side. It was financial perspective. What you would expect is what you would expect. A financial perspective is going to be focused purely on the numbers, okay? So revenues, how can we increase our revenue? That may be a question. That's the financial perspective. Expenses, maybe we can do a better job at controlling costs. Financial perspective. Productivity, could we use our assets more efficiently? Okay. All these are bases of achieving our specific financial goals. So we're gonna log these in as what we want from our financial perspective. But then everything we do is not going to be purely financial, because in order to meet those specific objectives there at our financial level, let's talk about it from the customer perspective. How about the price? Well, we need a good price in order to achieve our goals. How can we do that? What a great price compared to the other dealers. Well, let's look at our pricing strategies and see, how do we compare to others? Do we have the value there to actually justify our increased price, or do we want to see if we can find a way to increase our volumes and lower our prices? Quality. This car got great quality ratings and customer reports. How is our quality of our products? What's the customer surveys say? Do they like our products? Let's look at ways of measuring these elements in order to achieve our over financial goals. Sales and service. I'm impressed the salesperson really knew what he was talking about. Well, maybe customer satisfaction reviews. What are some things we can look from there? And delivery time. I'm so glad I can drive this car home today. Well, let's measure our delivery time. How often do we meet our delivery times? That would be another performance indicator we may look, because if we're doing well with these items, that should lead to a better financial perspective. Okay, that was the top right quadrant. Now we're going to look at the bottom right. That's the internal business perspective. Now we're really looking at things that are really hard to measure, but we can't ignore them simply because it's difficult to measure. In fact, what we want to do is make sure that we're putting adequate attention to these areas. Internal business perspective, innovation. Are we doing everything we can to look at the future? Are we designing new products for the future? If we're not, we better maybe put some emphasis on that. Maybe we put some dollar amounts. Maybe we create a department where we hire new people for innovation. That may be what we want to focus in on for the future. What are we doing in terms of efficiency? Are we making our operations a little more efficient? Are we doing things to move things a little faster through the operations? Don't lose sight of quality, but let's always try to find ways of doing things better and faster, right? And then post-sales service. Are we able to follow through with after the sale customer support? Or are we keeping our customers happy after the sale is made? So these are 3 areas that we might include in an internal business perspective. This isn't an all-inclusive list. You can't add to this, but this is an example of 3 internal business perspectives that we might want to look at and might decide to use as a basis for developing KPIs or key performance indicators. And then finally, on the last quadrant, the far left quadrant, learning and growth. And when we're talking about learning and growth, we're talking about employee capabilities, information system capabilities, and climate for action. Employee capabilities, do we have the right employees? Have we hired the right people? Are we giving them the skills they need? Are they content? Are they ready to move elsewhere? Are our turnover rates high or low? We're going to look at this as a basis of developing our employees, and maybe a key KPI, a key performance indicator, might be a low turnover rate. Maybe we can look at that, identify what we want, measure it. Information systems, do we need to update our information systems? Are there systems that are better than ours that are making other companies gain a competitive advantage? And if so, what are some things we can do different? And then climate for action. And this is more like a cultural, the way you view your perspective, the climate. What's the culture like in your organization? And the question here is, employee morale is good, but we still could improve. Okay, is it good? You want to measure that. Can you measure it? I don't know, maybe you can, maybe you don't, but you definitely want to put some in place, something that would help improve morale. Maybe the morale can be judged on turnover rates, employee turnover rates. Maybe that's where we're going to put employee turnovers to judge whether or not we have a high morale. If we have, the suggestion is if we have low turnover rates, in other words, we're not losing so many employees, they're staying with us for longer periods of times, then we can conclude that, generally speaking, employees are happy. That's probably going to lead us to conclude that we have a high morale. By the same token, if we have high turnover rates, we're losing employees left and right, they come and they go, then we might conclude that we don't have a high employee morale because people come and go without really giving a second thought. Finally, we're going to talk about sustainability and performance evaluation. Sustainability, again, we've talked about this in the past, but it's all about finding ways of thinking in a longer term and making sure we're protecting our environment. And so we're going to probably or likely incorporate relevant sustainability KPIs and performance evaluation systems that take into consideration sustainability. Does it make sense for us to destroy ourselves or our planet or anything else if, how good we are if we're just going to just eliminate ourselves, right? So let's look at sustainability as a way. PepsiCo performance perspectives, human sustainability, people in society, how can they make sure that they don't cause harm to any people? Talent sustainability, keeping the right people in the right place. Environmental sustainability, making sure we're not damaging the environment. And then financial performance, you got to have a good financial performance from a company in order for it to stay alive. Responsible and sustainable sourcing, and community and philanthropy. Okay, community and philanthropy is about giving to the public, donating to the resources, making yourselves and people in your employees available for volunteer elements. responsible and sustaining source, sustainable source. Okay, so that concludes chapter 10. I hope we learned a lot today. So thank you and be safe.